I think it's very fair to say that Russia is not winning. In fact, we could be more definitive and say Russia is losing. And that's why every day I'm just amazed to read the headlines. They sound so shocking, so amazed. Russia is taking territory inside of Ukraine. But that sort of a headline totally misses the point. It shows a total lack of comprehension of what's happening. Yes, Russia is taking territory because the Ukrainians cede it to the Russians. Keep in mind, a war of attrition helps the bigger country, not the smaller country. There's less than 25 million people in free Ukraine. There's 145 million people in Russia. So Ukraine is taking a different path. And that's where it's so abundantly clear that things are going well for Ukraine, not badly. Let's look specifically. Russia, to engage in a war of attrition, needs to engage with Ukrainian troops. But if the Ukrainians realize that they're holding a position that's not easy to defend or will be costly in terms of lives, yes, they cede it. Most of this territory is empty fields or abandoned villages. These aren't population centers. These are not people that are going to be taken into Russian occupation as a result. So, because of this, Ukraine does move away, and in doing so, moves to more secure positions. But there's something else going on here. Ukraine has realized that allowing Russia to engage with it directly, as Russia wishes, would of course grind down the Ukrainians. And that's why they've been so successful in using drones for surveillance to see what the Russians are up to. And when they realize that the Russians are planning to launch an assault, the Ukrainians either reposition or they attack the position. They attack the Russians with things like HIMARS or even drones. But there's another aspect to this. The Ukrainians, to prevent the Russians from even getting to that point, where they're on the verge of launching an attack, well, they've been striking supply lines. They've been striking the Russian convoys. We've seen them strike the Russian trains, even in the occupied territories and in Russia. But within Russia, that's where it's gotten even more interesting. Within Russia, Ukraine is successfully carrying out attacks. And now the pace is picking up. It's almost every single day there's more stories of attacks carried out by Ukraine using drones within the territory of Russia. And the attacks within Russia have a few different positives. For one, obviously they're destroying military infrastructure and manufacturing within Russia that's used for the war effort. But there's another aspect of this. It's creating within the society a tension. The population doesn't know what to do. They can't believe that they're being forced now into bomb shelters. How is it possible that we, the owners of the world's second greatest army, are beholden to what the Ukrainians choose for our future? We can't even control our own airspace in the capital. And there's another aspect. If Ukraine is able to demilitarize the Russians within Russia so that the Russians cannot ship replacements or supplies back to occupied Ukraine, back to their troops there, how's Russia suspect that it's going to be able to fight the war in the long term? Because Ukraine's going after very strategic factories. They're going after the factories that produce things like the drones, but also parts. And there's been a lot of sabotage in Russia, not just drones. So at this point, Russia has very few options. Obviously, Iran, with whom it works and with whom it works specifically on drones, is unlikely to be supplying it with a lot of drone parts in the near future. Iran's got its own problems at the moment. But more than that, Iran had requested Russia's help for months to send weapons, to send air defense. But the Russians, well, they need the air defense for themselves because at present, Russia is facing every single day across the country more attacks. And if they're across the entire landmass of Russia, keep in mind it's 11 time zones, it's a huge area, it's very hard to protect all that when you have very limited air defense. But ultimately, why does Ukraine do this? So Ukraine does this for the obvious military reasons, which we discussed. But there's another component to this. I've argued for a long time, for 3 years at least, that this war could end one of three ways. It could end militarily, as Ukraine simply expels the Russians, but it seems very unlikely, very difficult at least, given the size of the Russian military. But there's something else. There's two other ways that this could end. One is that this could end due to political reasons or due to economic reasons. So when I mention political reasons, think about this. It seems improbable, But it wasn't too long ago that Yevgeny Prigozhin decided to take a ride with the Wagner Group towards Moscow. And along that way, we noticed a few different things. One, the Russian military, they didn't stop him. The Russian National Guard didn't stop him. The Chechens didn't stop him. The police didn't stop him. The people that he met along the way came and greeted him. They brought him food. The Russian senior military leadership with whom he met in Rostov drank coffee with him. They told him, you shouldn't do this. This isn't a good idea. But they didn't call an airstrike on him, though they knew where he was 100 kilometers in advance as he was approaching the city. But their lack of action is similar to others. Remember, Dmitry Medvedev, Kirill, the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, like Vladimir Putin himself, were silent. They didn't say anything. It seems they weren't really sure what was going to happen. And at least in the case of Medvedev and Kirill, maybe they just didn't want to start a fight with the guy who could become their new boss. So they took no action. They said nothing. They didn't speak up on behalf of Putin. Such is the political situation in Russia. But there's another aspect of the political section. If you are looking at the current situation today from within Russia, as an oligarch, for instance, the oligarchs, many of them, have their own private military companies. Incredibly enough, with a huge amount of lack of foresight that Putin allowed that, these oligarchs have their own private military companies. Now, what is the actual result of that? So some of them do work directly with the government, but others, they have their own entities in order to specifically defend their assets, defend their interest. The reality is, many of them are probably thinking, what's going to happen once Putin dies? There's going to be a lot of fighting, there's going to be a lot of strife, and one faction of oligarchs is probably going to try to liquidate the other faction of oligarchs, and hence why the oligarchs have their own allegiances and alliances with people in the intelligence services as well as within the military. But neither here nor there, if you realize, well, they could take power, and they're going to liquidate me if they come to power, my opponents, wouldn't you be smarter to be the one that takes power now? Putin is 72. He'll turn 73 on October 7th. The smartest thing you could do is seize power yourself. Prevent some other oligarchical faction from taking power. But to do that's a huge risk. Didn't work out well for Prigozhin. But in order to take that risk, if you realize that there was a real shot at it, you'd probably look for different things, like the population is not going to try to slow you down, or you find that people in the military are dissatisfied. And conveniently enough, they are dissatisfied. They're not happy about the way that this war is going, and they're not happy about the way that the military leadership, the civilian appointees, are prosecuting the war. If somebody could get one of them to flip, or lots of them to flip, that'd be interesting. And sure enough, right now, there's a large conflict between the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, and the Russian military. Now that conflict goes back to the Soviet Union, but today it's more tense than ever, especially after the June 1st Spiderweb attacks, where both sides accused the other for being responsible for the attacks and for failing. That could boil over. That could get far worse. So once again, why do the drone attacks have to matter? Well, the drone attacks matter because within Russia, nobody's quite sure what's going to happen. But when you start to see lots of explosions and the population starts to think that things are getting out of control, that's typically the moment that people take action. And the Ukrainians, trust me, they are aware of that. The more that you can start to provoke in the minds of oligarchs, provoke in the minds of leaders, that maybe it's time to have a Putin-free world. That's very dangerous for Putin, but everyone is going to act in their own interest at the end of the day. But another way that this war could end, outside the political element, is economically. Keep in mind, the Russian economy is in dire straits. We just heard last week at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the head of the central bank say that they'd burnt through the reserves they had, specifically the ones that were able to help them when the sanctions first were implemented. Now, they simply don't have that sort of money. They can't do it anymore. The Minister of Economics himself said the country is entering into a recession. We see that they have a 20% interest rate at the central bank. We see that the real inflation rate's probably about 27%. There's a lot of problems within Russia. But those are all secondary things. Those are all interesting. But a new story came out today which is much more specific, and I would argue much more interesting. So, a Russian company that was well known, located in Stavropol, it was called Optron. So Optron produces specifically electronics for the Russian military, microelectronics. And those microelectronics were used for the MiGs, the Sukhoi, Tupolev, serious company, one of very few supplying the Russian government. And what's interesting about it is they're closing their doors. The factory's going out of business. And why is that? Well, they got a couple $1 million worth of debt. And why do they have a couple $1 million worth of debt? Well, the government hasn't paid its bills. But more than that, its ownership said that the government had driven into the ground. By paying only about $33 per unit, when the market price is $46 per unit, the government was bankrupting its own supplier. It was forcing it into the red. And thereby, Russia is depriving its own self of a future of being able to have these micro technologies. Now, why that's important is that, once again, Russia has very few options. Without this company, they don't have a full list of other companies they can go to supply them. And now that Iran's off the table, it makes things all the harder for Russia. But it says something else. The Russian government, of course, knows that it needs this company. So why doesn't it bail it out? Why doesn't it pay its bills? Because there's significant liquidity problems within Russia and for the Russian government. And these are sort of cracks that we've been anticipating for a couple of years. These are the signs, and there'll probably be more companies in the near future who simply can't keep up with the government not paying, or with the government's high inflation that it's created through its high spending in the military, which makes the money that they're receiving sort of worthless, which makes paying people virtually impossible. All this is destabilizing the Russian economy. And ultimately, when the economy does collapse, which it will eventually, what happens is a lot of different things. One is, of course, panic. But secondly, wars end very, very quickly. Because when soldiers aren't getting paid, and when soldiers aren't being supplied, they stop fighting. The Russian soldiers who are there today, and all the evidence that we have, the largest reason that they join the military is economic. They're there for the money, and nothing else. So, going ahead, Vladimir Putin's got a lot of complicated things. He's got a lot of problems. And ultimately, we saw this start to change for Ukraine. We saw when the invasion of Kursk, Russia began by the Ukrainians, and the successful occupation of Kursk, Russia, that was a turning point. Unfortunately, the Americans at the time were trying to get them to stop that, but now it seems that at least this is allowed. And what we can recognize is this sort of thing, these sort of game changers, these paradigm shifts are necessary. Had we allowed Ukraine to do this sooner, had we allowed Ukraine to take the war to Russia sooner, the war perhaps could have already been finished. But unfortunately, we've tied Ukraine's arms for years. So at this stage, we can hope that not only is Ukraine going to receive the assistance it needs to continue fighting, but that we do everything we can to support the Ukrainians to take that fight to Russia. And in fact, I'll put a link below for the group with which I visited Kursk, Russia, the military unit, who is now, once again, seeking to fundraise for more drones so they can continue to defend the skies and to protect Ukrainian lives. But neither here nor there. Vladimir Putin is in a very difficult situation. His options are tight, and in the past week, we've seen more very bizarre statements from Putin that are very uncharacteristic, where he looks visibly nervous. In one situation, he was talking about the economy, and he tried to joke about it, but he was stuttering his words. Another time, when he was in an interview, and he decided to go off on this tangent about how he had nothing to apologize for and he had not committed any mistakes. It was very strange. But it probably also indicates something. It indicates what's actually on his mind. The economy's in the ditch. The war is not going well. There's no easy off-ramp. Iran's off the table. Russian targets within Russia are being struck. Russia's critical infrastructure is being destroyed. And there's nothing he could do to stop it. So I think what Vladimir Putin would worry the most about is not necessarily even the war, but more specifically, if somebody else is going to understand that he's weak right now. Because it's precisely in moments like this that dictators can come to a very rapid and violent end. So in the coming weeks, there'll be a lot going on. Please like this video. Please also subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like, become a member of the channel. Thank you for watching today. And as always, I thank you for supporting Ukraine.